This video discusses about Orientalism by Edward Said. The meaning of Orientalism is the characteristic, styles, artifacts or traits of the people and the cultures of Asia. This book, Orientalism, is written in the year 1978 by the famous critic writer Edward Said. Before we see its explanation, let's see about Edward. He was born in the year 1935 in Jerusalem, Mandatory Palestine. Mandatory Palestine is a geopolitical identity which was established between 1920 and 1948 in the regions of Palestine. He died in the year 2003 in New York, United States. Edward was a professor of literature at Columbia University. He was a public intellect and a founder of the academic field of postcolonial studies. He was born as a Palestinian American, born in Mandatory Palestine. He educated in the Westernized school. In all his works, he applied his Westernized education and his bilateral perspective to illuminate the gaps that prevails between the culture and the political understanding between the Western world and the Eastern world. Especially, he talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. His principal influences were Antonio Francisco Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist philosopher, journalist, linguist, writer, and politician. He wrote on philosophy, political theory, sociology, history, and linguistics. Next is Frantz Fanon, who was a French Western Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher. Frantz Fanon's works were in the field of postcolonial studies, critical theory, and Marxism. Next is Aimé Césaire. He was a Martinican poet, author, and politician. He was one of the founders of Negritude movement in Francophone literature, and he coined the word negritude in French. Next is Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher and called as historian of ideas. He was a writer, political activist, and literary critic. Next is Theodor Adorno, who was a German philosopher, psychologist, musicologist, and a composer who's known for his critical theory of society. As a cultural critic, Edward Said is known for his book Orientalism, which he writes in the year 1978. He talks about the cultural representations that are basis of Orientalism, which means how the Western world perceives the Orient. Orient is referred to the Eastern world, which refers the various cultures or social structures, nations, and psychological systems. As it refers to the Eastern world, it denotes the part of Asia or the countries and cultures of Europe, the Mediterranean region, and the Arab world. Let's see an overview of Orientalism. In his book, Edward talks about the exaggeration of difference, that is, the idea that is taken to be true on the basis of probability by the Western superiority, and the application of cliched analytical models that is perceived by the Orient world. As I have already mentioned, the Orient world is the term for the East, that is traditionally that comprises the Eastern world in relation to Europe. Edward says that Orientalism is the crucial source of the inaccurate cultural representations that form the foundations of Western thought and the perception of the Eastern world, especially in relation to the Middle East region. The Middle East region are the Arab countries. Edward Said says that the cultural representation of the Western world usually depicts the Eastern world as primitive, irrational, violent, despotic, fanatic, and essentially inferior to the Westerner. And since the Western world consider Eastern world to be primitives, enlightenment can only occur when traditional and reactionary values are replaced by contemporary and progressive ideas. And these contemporary and progressive ideas are either Western or Western influenced ideas. He says in practice, the westernized world through imperial and colonial power, facilitated by the wartime collaboration of European Arab identities, has romanticized the representation of Arab culture. He says that the Western world has exploited the Middle Eastern part. Despite the exploitation, the Western world justified their imperial power and policies that happened in the Middle Eastern areas. Edward Said also describes Orientalism as a discourse. Discourse is a long and serious discussion of a subject. It can be in speech or in a written form. He also denotes some of French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault's definition of discourse. Foucault has defined discourse as a system of thought that governs the knowledge obtained by a person. And this knowledge comes to a person through preconceived notions and ideas. Notion means something that you have in your mind already, the thought that you have in your mind. So Michel Foucault says that a discourse is the product of interaction between power and knowledge that interconnects in a never-ending circle. So in Foucault's view, knowledge is power and also the way of gaining power. So Edward Said, being influenced by Foucault's ideas, which focuses on the relationship between power and knowledge, he argued that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot comprehend the hugely systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage or even construct the Orient. The Orient is the Eastern world, as I mentioned already. So, only through examining Orientalism as a discourse, the Western culture, they controlled the Orient, that is the Eastern world. They controlled it through politically, militarily, sociologically, scientifically, imaginatively, and ideologically during the post-Enlightenment period. There are 3 chapters that Edward Said writes in his book. The first chapter is the scope of Orientalism. Second is Oriental structures and restructures. Third is Orientalism now. Edward also makes another reference from his influential person, Antonio Gramsci. He takes the concepts of hegemony derived by the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci. Hegemony means a control or power by one country to the primitive nation. Using this terminology, Edward shows how Orientalism served as a system of representation which served to consolidate the West's authority and supremacy over the Eastern countries. As referred by Foucault, that knowledge is power. Edward Said makes a distinction between pure knowledge and political knowledge. For pure knowledge, he takes the example of a simple math, that is 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. But for political knowledge, he says that the domination is involved through the specialist studies. For political knowledge, he first gives an example of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1978. He also mentions the process and ultimate goal of colonization. He says that through the specialist power, the colonizers has taken central authority over the subjugated people and the subalterns. They also were able to transform the subjugated people and the subalterns into mere raw materials using their colonial power. Edward quoted Paul Valéry's quotes. Paul Valéry said that while Europe owned its heritage of the arts and knowledge to the Orient, they were still monsters. So the colonizers, being changed as monsters, they deal by maintaining the power of choice. But this was not accepted by Edward Said, so he saw this as a grave error, and he stated this clearly in his Orientalism as human identity is not only natural and stable, but constructed and occasionally even invented outright. Edward said that no one would be able to find or would form their mind of the Negro mind or the Jewish personality. However, it was acceptable to form essential qualities of the Islamic mind and the Arab characters. The colonizers thought over the Arabs and the Semites of Islam is therefore considered to be a racism. Even though the colonizers often think and say that they were bringing enlightenment to the uncivilized people, their thought of enlightenment to the uncivilized people itself is a thought of racism and a quality of dominance and control. Now let's see the chapters. Chapter 1, the scope of Orientalism. In chapter 1, Edward describes how the science of Orientalism developed as a system of knowledge in the contemporary times. According to Edward Said, the Western Orientals structured the world with two opposing elements, ours and theirs. They were not just geographical divisions, but more importantly, epistemological ones. The West and East were to be cultural distinctions, and they had differences in civilization, or some of the countries they lack civilizations. In Western eyes, Orients, that is the Middle Eastern countries, were incapable of taking care of themselves. They were seen as lazy, lustful, irrational, and violent, and also exotic and mysterious. The Western country people, they started to self-proclaim themselves as superiors, and they also showed their superiority over the Eastern countries. And this superior thought also makes the Western scholars to think themselves superior than the Orients. Thus, they started to Orientalizing them, and they started to subject them to Western standards which did not favor them. According to Edward Said, researchers and men of administrative from the Western side, they took a very Eurocentric and they therefore biased and selective approach to understand the Orients. The Western scholars also used their own terminologies to define and analyze the Orients. And in the end, Orientalism for Said was fundamentally a system of self-projection by the Westerners. The Orients served as a mirror for the Westerners who wanted to see themselves superior. Throughout chapter 1, Edward Said talks about the Western knowledge of the East was never neutral, since it was always involved with a political and cultural agenda that also includes sexual fantasies. Let's see chapter 2, Orientalist Structures and Restructures. In this chapter, Edward Said describes a shift in Western attitude towards the Orients in modern times. Edward also observes the shift in Western attitude as a field of knowledge which is romanticized the non-Western world for the Western viewers. The shape and content of the Orients were devised by Western eyes, Said explains that the Orient as the West's other in the 19th century, which took a new modern shape, which saw it as an unspoiled and innocent form of human existence compared with the highly civilized. Therefore, the Middle Eastern countries are complicated and even unnatural. And this attitude not only means that the Westerners see the Orients as superior to them, on the contrary, they also view the purity of the Orients. Another justification by the Westerners provided by Orientalism for the rule of the West over the East was a form of social Darwinism, which pointed to the fact that the West developed faster than other parts of the world, which is seen as a proof of the Westerners as biologically superior. The Westerners also think that the higher development rate of the West leads them to discover the others. Edward includes two dominant works of 19th century Orientalists, that is, Silvestre de Sacy and Ernest Renan. In chapter 3, Orientalism Now, Orientalism is devoted to explore the most recent developments, that is, during Said's time. He says that European colonialism was the geographical basis of Orientalism, both in geopolitical and in cultural aspects. He considers Orientalism and colonialism were both driven by a quest for knowledge and power. Edward also talks about 20th century politics and the change in relationship between the Eastern countries and the Western countries. One of the main differences in the 20th century is that Orientalists became much more involved in the everyday lives of Orientals, unlike their predecessors who were involved as observers. Edward says that the center of Orientalism shifts from Europe to the US following World War I. Orientalism in the US were related to social sciences, unlike linguistics in Europe. Orientalism as a field was aimed to assist the government in finding ways to control non-Western societies, and decolonization processes following World War II, which did not mean the end of Orientalism, which was made implicit instead of explicit. He talks about the four categories. One is popular image and social science representation, public relations policy, merely Islam, to see the Orient as an imitation West. In the first category, Said discusses the popular image and social science that represents the East. In the second category, public relations policies, here he points the work of Ernest Renan in 1840s, also points the work of Gustav von Grünschborn. Gustav is an German Orientalist who entertains an almost virulent dislike for Islam. Edward finds three dogmas implicit in the works of Gustav. Those are absolute difference between the Occident, that is superior, and the Orient, the inferior. The superior of abstractions regarding the Orient against direct evidence from the contemporary Orient itself. Third is the recognition that the Orient is to be feared and controlled. In the third and fourth category, Edward winds up his discussion of Orientalism by briefly addressing the positive side to the problem of reliable scholarship in the field of Orientalism. Let's see the conclusion. In this book, Edward Said clearly stated that Orientalism was not a product of colonial rule, but as a pattern of knowledge, it preceded colonialism. He does mentions two 18th century intellects. One is Abraham Duperron and the other is William Jones. These two intellects spearheaded the transition of Orientalism from literary to scientific knowledge. He provides a clear example of discussion made by Lord Baffler in the speech when he gave it in the House of Commons in the year 1910. In the speech, Lord Baffler, he clearly justified Britain's presence and involvement in Egypt. Edward concludes saying that it is necessary for each group people to speak for itself and they have to create their own discourse for making their own history, and they should also share in dialogue with other people groups with the goal of true knowledge of the other and not merely with political knowledge. Hope this video helped you. Thank you for listening.